There is one sentence, just one, and when you finally say it, when you truly mean it, when it rises up from somewhere so deep inside you that it no longer sounds like a question or a plea or a bargaining chip, everything changes. Not because the words carry some hidden magic, but because the person speaking them has become someone the narcissist never planned for, someone they never accounted for, someone they spent years trying to dismantle piece by piece, layer by layer, and simply could not finish the job. That sentence is coming. But first you need to hear something clearly, honestly, and with the respect your experience actually deserves. What happened to you was not just a difficult relationship. It was not a communication breakdown, a clash of personalities, or two people who simply were not compatible. What happened was a slow, deliberate, often unconscious erosion of your sense of self, carried out by someone who needed to diminish you in order to feel complete. If your chest just tightened reading that, if something in you just exhaled in recognition, stay with this, because it was written with you in mind. Let's talk about what actually frightens a narcissist, because most people get this wrong. Many people assume exposure is the final key, as if truth is a locked door and public witnessing is the right sequence of keys turning at the right speed will inevitably force it open. That if enough voices align, enough screenshots accumulate, enough contradictions are made visible in front of the right audience, something inside the other person will finally collapse under the weight of undeniability. But psychological systems built around image, control, or fragile self-concept rarely operate like legal equations where evidence simply sums into resolution. They operate more like internal ecosystems, where perception matters more than consensus, and narrative often matters more than fact. So exposure does not always land where people expect it to land. Because the central issue is not simply what happened, but what does it mean within the internal story that preserves psychological stability? In many cases, that story is not primarily anchored in objective truth. It is anchored in emotional survival, in self-image preservation, in maintaining coherence between how one sees oneself and how one believes others must be positioned in order for that self-image to remain intact. Which is why exposure alone often fails to produce the transformation people imagine. Truth, when delivered externally, still has to pass through internal defenses before it becomes psychologically real. And those defenses are rarely simple denial. They are more sophisticated than that. They can include reframing, selective memory, emotional minimization, counteraccusation, or shifting the interpretive frame so that even contradictory evidence gets absorbed into a revised narrative rather than dismantling it. From the outside, it can look like refusal to accept reality. From the inside, it often feels like maintaining coherence under threat. And this is where the assumption breaks. Because people often believe the goal is collapse, that if the truth becomes loud enough, it will force an internal reckoning. But in many relational dynamics, the psyche is not optimized for truth acceptance. It is optimized for self-continuity. The system's priority is not what is objectively true, but what allows me to remain internally consistent without fragmentation. So even exposure can be metabolized rather than resolved. Yet there is something more psychologically destabilizing than exposure. It is not being proven wrong. It is losing interpretive access to someone. It is when the other person no longer fits the script that your internal model was built around, when they no longer respond predictably, when guilt no longer produces return, when attention no longer produces emotional leverage, when absence no longer produces collapse in them, when presence no longer guarantees emotional availability. At that point, the system is not dealing with accusation. It is dealing with unpredictability. And unpredictability cannot be easily narrated away because narratives rely on stable character roles: victim, rescuer, abandoner, loyal one, unstable one, dependent one, forgiving one. When someone changes their psychological role, especially from predictable dependency into grounded autonomy, it disrupts the entire relational map. And that disruption is far more disorienting than external exposure, because exposure is something outside the system, but change is something inside it. Jung would frame this not as a battle of truth versus deception, but as a collapse of projection. When someone is first drawn into an emotionally charged bond, they rarely see the other person directly. They see a constructed image layered over them. That image is formed from needs, fears, expectations, unresolved emotional material, and unconscious pattern recognition. The other person becomes a screen for meaning, and as long as the screen remains stable, the projection feels real. But when the person begins to individuate, when they stop over-accommodating, stop over-explaining, stop over-functioning in the emotional role assigned to them, the projection loses resolution. The screen starts to move, and what was once clear becomes unreadable. This is where the real fracture happens, not in exposure, but in loss of psychological control over meaning. Because control is not just about actions, it is about predictability of interpretation. If someone can be reliably interpreted, they can be emotionally navigated, but if they become internally anchored, self-referential, and no longer reactive in expected ways, then interpretation fails. And when interpretation fails, the system tries to restore it, sometimes through escalation. Sometimes the shift in dynamics is not met with open confrontation, but with subtler forms of recalibration. Not because there is a calculated strategy in every moment, but because relational systems often try to return to equilibrium when they feel destabilized. And when the familiar emotional patterns stop working, the interaction itself can become a kind of testing ground again. Confusion-based engagement is one of those patterns that can appear when predictability is lost. It is not always deliberate in a fully conscious sense, but it has a recognizable shape. Communication may become slightly inconsistent in tone, timing, or meaning. Signals that once felt clear begin to feel layered or contradictory. Warmth may appear without continuity, or distance may appear without explanation. The result is not necessarily outright conflict, but a state where clarity is intermittently disrupted. From the outside, it can feel like emotional static. Not a clean yes or no, but a shifting field where interpretation becomes harder to stabilize. The mind naturally tries to resolve this. It looks for patterns. It tries to reestablish coherence. It fills gaps with meaning. But when the signals keep changing, interpretation itself becomes tiring. The experience is less about what is explicitly said and more about the emotional effort required to keep making sense of what is being communicated. In many relational dynamics, clarity creates boundaries, but confusion keeps attention engaged, not always intentionally and not always maliciously, but because unresolved ambiguity tends to pull the psyche back into participation. It invites continued emotional investment, continued decoding, continued re-engagement with the same relational field that is no longer functioning in its original way. Alongside this, there can be attempts to reinsert old emotional triggers. These are moments where familiar patterns are subtly reactivated, not necessarily through overt repetition, but through echoes of earlier dynamics. A tone that once led to reassurance, a pause that once created anxiety, a compliment that once restored closeness after distance, a silence that once prompted self-doubt and reattachment. The psyche remembers these patterns even when the conscious mind believes it has moved beyond them. Emotional conditioning is not purely intellectual, it is embodied. It lives in anticipation, in reflex, in the subtle tightening of attention when a familiar signal appears again. So when old triggers are reintroduced, even lightly, they can activate older versions of the self that were organized around seeking resolution through external emotional cues. What makes this particularly complex is that these patterns often do not appear as obvious manipulation. They can be woven into ordinary interaction. A sudden return of warmth after withdrawal. A nostalgic reference to a time when connection felt stronger. A moment of attention that arrives just when distance had begun to settle. These moments can feel meaningful on their own, but their deeper effect is often cumulative. They pull the internal system back toward an earlier version of relational engagement. And this is where psychological tension arises, because growth moves in one direction, toward stability, self-reference, and internal coherence. But old relational patterns often pull toward reactivity, external reference, and emotional fluctuation. When both forces are present, the experience becomes one of oscillation. A part of you recognizes the pattern, another part still responds to it. One part seeks clarity, another part feels pulled into familiarity. Jung might describe this as the tension between consciousness and unconscious patterning. The conscious mind begins to observe the repetition, begins to recognize the structure behind the emotional shifts. But the unconscious layer still carries the imprint of earlier attachment dynamics, where connection was maintained through responsiveness to emotional cues rather than grounded stability. So the result is not simply confusion in the other person's behavior. It is a moment where two internal systems are interacting, one evolving toward differentiation, the other attempting to reestablish old forms of emotional regulation. Importantly, this does not always reflect intentional design. Human behavior in emotionally charged relationships is often a mixture of habit, unconscious expectation, and learned relational strategy. People tend to repeat what once worked, especially when faced with uncertainty. If a certain emotional pattern once restored closeness or reduced tension, there may be an unconscious tendency to revisit it when stability feels threatened. But from the perspective of the person who is changing, the effect is what matters most. Because the experience is not just about isolated interactions, it is about whether the overall relational field supports growth or pulls it backward. Over time, what becomes most revealing is not any single moment of confusion or reconnection, but the pattern itself. Whether clarity becomes more consistent or less. Whether emotional engagement becomes more stable or more conditional. Whether the relationship begins to support a new version of selfhood or repeatedly activates older versions that were built around uncertainty. And this is where individuation quietly asserts itself again. Because once you start to see patterns rather than just moments, your participation changes. You begin to experience interaction less as something that defines you and more as something you observe. Emotional triggers may still arise, but they are increasingly recognized rather than fully inhabited. The old loops may still appear, but they no longer carry the same authority over your inner state. In that space, confusion loses some of its power. Not because it disappears, but because it is no longer the primary organizing principle of your emotional reality. And when that shift happens, the dynamic itself begins to reorganize around a different center of gravity. Not always consciously, often reflexively, because the mind prefers a painful known pattern over an unknown one. So the deeper fear is not, people will find out. It is, I can no longer reliably define what this person is in relation to me. And that is a loss of psychological ownership over the narrative, not ownership of the person themselves, but ownership of the story that kept the dynamic stable. This is why your earlier insight matters in a deeper way. Because the version of you that was once emotionally legible was not just easier to relate to, it was easier to position, easier to predict, easier to manage within the internal structure of someone else's emotional world. But as you change, something subtle but irreversible happens. You stop being a fixed character in someone else's psychological script, and you begin becoming an independent narrative, one that cannot be fully anticipated, one that cannot be fully reinserted into old emotional cause and effect loops. And at that point, even exposure becomes secondary, because the deeper destabilizer has already occurred. Not that truth has been revealed, but that the relationship between identity and control has been broken. And what remains is no longer about proving anything. It is about no longer being governable by old interpretations at all. Others believe a narcissist fears anger, that raising your voice, refusing to accommodate, pushing back with the same intensity you have absorbed for years will finally make them retreat. And some, usually those who have stayed longest, worn down until they barely recognize themselves, believe the narcissist fears losing them, having been conditioned to measure their own value by how desperately they get pulled back in. But here is what actually keeps a narcissist awake at night. Here is what makes them escalate the instant things grow too peaceful. Here is the one thing they cannot manage, cannot exploit, cannot spin or explain away. What terrifies a narcissist at the deepest level is someone who no longer needs them to define what is real, someone who no longer requires their approval to know the truth, someone whose inner sense of self has become so steady, so solid, so resistant to manipulation that no amount of charm, rage, or manufactured chaos can shake it loose. A narcissist fears someone who is genuinely, completely, permanently finished with them. Not angry finished, not hurt finished, not the kind of finished where you announce you are leaving and then circle back. Finished the way a door closes without an echo. Finished in a way where the silence itself becomes a presence. The presence of someone who has chosen themselves so fully there is simply no space left for the narcissist to occupy. To understand why a person like that is so frightening, you have to understand what a narcissist actually is. Not the cartoonish version everyone pictures, the loud, obviously arrogant person who dominates every room. Some do look like that. Plenty do not. Many are quiet, charming, attentive, even generous at times. Remarkably skilled at making you feel like the center of the universe right up until you are not. Many present themselves as the victim in every story they tell, the wounded soul who simply needs someone to finally love them correctly. Many look exactly like the person you fell for, trusted, and built an entire life around. What connects every version of narcissism, once you know how to spot it, is this: an inability to accept the full humanity of another person, a basic incapacity to see you as a whole, complex, independent human being, someone whose needs and feelings and boundaries matter in their own right, not merely because of how they serve or threaten the narcissist. You were never truly a person to them. You were a function. And the moment you stopped functioning the way they required, they did not grieve losing you. They punished you for it. If part of you is resisting that idea right now, insisting it cannot possibly be true of the person you loved, consider this. When did they celebrate something good happening to you without somehow redirecting attention to themselves? When did they sit with your pain without steering the conversation back to their own? When did they actually hear a boundary you set and respect it? Not because they agreed or even understood it, but simply because it belonged to you and that alone was reason enough? I am not asking to hurt you. I am asking because clarity matters here. And clarity is not the same thing as cruelty. Clarity is where getting your life back actually begins. The architecture of narcissistic control is never built overnight. It starts with mirroring. Early in the relationship, the narcissist becomes whoever you need them to be. They reflect your values, share your interests, seem to understand your wounds with an accuracy that feels almost impossible. This is not always conscious manipulation. Many narcissists genuinely believe, at least at first, that the version of themselves they are performing is real. The painful part is that what you fell for was largely a reflection of yourself, a version of them constructed specifically to draw you in. And when that image began to crack, when the real person underneath started showing through, your mind did something entirely understandable and entirely dangerous. It clung to the original picture. It told you that was the real them. And this new coldness, cruelty, or dismissiveness was something else entirely. Stress, fear, old wounds, or something you must have done. And so an internal war began between what you experienced and what you were told you experienced, between what you felt and what you were told you should feel, between who you were and who you were slowly being reshaped into. This is what psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance, and it sits at the core of narcissistic control. The narcissist does not need to physically restrain you. They control you through confusion, through the relentless back and forth between warmth and withdrawal, praise and punishment, genuine connection and baffling cruelty. Your nervous system, that old survival-oriented part of your brain constantly scanning for safety, becomes hooked on the unpredictability itself. Inconsistency becomes the very thing binding you to them. When someone treats you inconsistently, your brain does not settle into the relationship. It works harder, trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle, watching, analyzing, adjusting, trying to figure out exactly what would bring back that earlier version of them. Here is the hard truth underneath that chase. The version you are chasing never actually existed. What existed was a performance, and you spent years auditioning for a role in a story that was never written with your well-being in mind. Gaslighting is a term most people recognize, but few grasp how deeply it actually operates. The more damaging form of gaslighting is not about individual incidents. It is about reshaping your entire relationship to reality. It is the slow, cumulative process of being made to feel your perceptions are wrong, your emotions are excessive, your needs are unreasonable, your memory cannot be trusted, your gut instincts are paranoia, your boundaries are attacks, your grief is manipulation, your anger is instability. Over time, you hand your own reality over to someone else. You stop asking yourself what you think or feel and start asking instead what they think, what they feel, what they will tolerate, what they will allow. You did not lose your mind. You did not become weak. You were systematically trained to distrust the very thing built to protect you, your own perception. If you have lived that, if you have stood in the middle of your own life, feeling like a stranger to yourself, uncertain of what was real and what had been planted there by someone else, understand this. That confusion is not who you are. That is what was done to you, and those are two very different things. There is a concept in psychology called trauma bonding, and it remains one of the most misunderstood ideas in relational psychology. Trauma bonding is a neurobiological process. It develops when cycles of harm and relief, threat and comfort, hurt and reward create a bond in the brain that can rival and sometimes even exceed the kind of bond formed through steady, healthy attachment. It is not weakness. It is not stupidity. It is not low self-worth. It is simply your brain responding exactly as brains do to a specific pattern of inconsistent reward. The research on this is clear. The bond was real. The chemistry was real. The love you felt was real, even though the person receiving it was never capable of honestly returning it. This matters enormously because so many survivors of narcissistic relationships drown in self-blame, asking why they stayed, why they went back, why they defended someone who was hurting them. The answer is not that something is fundamentally wrong with you. The answer is that something very specific happened to your nervous system. Understanding that is not an excuse. It is a foundation, the first brick in the wall separating you from everything that tried to erase who you are. Now consider the moment of reclamation, because it does eventually come. After enough reading, enough reflection, enough long nights sitting alone with the truth of what happened, there arrives a moment, different for everyone, when you stop trying to fix them. You stop needing them to understand you. You stop chasing the apology, the acknowledgement, the flicker of real remorse you deserve, but will almost certainly never receive. There comes a point where you no longer need them to confirm your reality because you simply step into it yourself. And when that shift happens, something changes in the dynamic that the narcissist can neither ignore nor control. Narcissistic control depends on a very specific fuel: your emotional reactivity, your hope, your fear, your anger, your love, your urgent need for resolution. As long as you are reacting, whether through rage, tears, or fighting back, the narcissist gets what they need: your engagement, your energy. Any reaction in any form is proof that you still care, and mattering to you is the supply that keeps them coming back. They are not returning because they love you. They are returning because you are still reacting. And when you genuinely stop, not performing calm but actually settling into it, the entire dynamic becomes unworkable. You cannot manipulate someone who wants nothing from you anymore. You cannot control someone who no longer fears losing you. The narcissist was never truly powerful. The cruelty, the control, the manipulation, the arrogance, none of it is strength. All of it is defense, the exhausting maintenance of a false self, usually constructed in early childhood, to shield a core that feels fundamentally unlovable. This does not excuse what they did to you, but it does mean something important. The person who hurt you was not operating from a position of strength. They were operating from fear. The rage was fear. The contempt was fear. The charm was fear. The silence was fear. Every tactic existed to help them avoid confronting something about themselves they could not face. And you, caring, empathetic, perceptive, open-hearted, walked into that with your arms open, offering the one thing they needed most and could never actually accept: real, unconditional regard. You offered them the chance to be seen and loved as a whole person, flaws included, and they simply could not receive it. Not because you offered it wrong, not because you were insufficient, but because the part of them capable of receiving it never had room to develop. Understanding this does not mean welcoming them back out of pity. It means you can finally stop taking any of it personally. You can stop asking what you did wrong. You can stop viewing yourself through the distorted lens of someone incapable of ever truly seeing you. You can begin picking up the mirror they shattered and piecing it back together, knowing every fragment you recover is not something to be ashamed of, but proof of a self that survived something designed to erase it. Now we arrive at the sentence and notice how we got here. Not through some clever trick, not through revenge, not through drama or a perfectly timed confrontation, but through understanding, through truth, through the slow, difficult, necessary work of seeing yourself and your situation with total clarity. Because that clarity is the only place this sentence can come from. Spoken in anger, it carries no weight. Spoken in hurt, it carries no weight. Spoken as strategy, it carries no weight. It only holds real power when it comes from a place of settled, unshakable knowing. The sentence is this: I no longer need anything from you. 5 words, or some version close to them, spoken without heat, without hope, without anger, without sorrow, spoken from a place of complete internal calm, not "I'm done with you," because that still implies effort spent on an ending, not "I hate you," because hatred is still a kind of closeness, not even "I forgive you," because forgiveness does not require an announcement to the person being forgiven. It happens quietly, privately, for you and by you, with no audience required. I no longer need anything from you. Whatever phrasing fits your own voice and your own truth, the meaning stays constant, and the narcissist will hear it, genuinely hear it, and feel something they have not felt since long before meeting you: the very specific fear of becoming truly irrelevant, not dismissed in a way that can be twisted into rejection, not left in a way that can be reframed as abandonment, not angry in a way that still hints at desire, simply, quietly, permanently, unnecessary. You will have become something they cannot manage, a person with no open wound left to press on, no desperate hope left to dangle, no fear left to trigger at will. A person who has looked squarely at the whole picture of who they are and walked away, not with bitterness, but with the quiet confidence of someone who finally knows their own worth and no longer needs it validated by someone who was never capable of seeing it in the first place. People who make it fully through narcissistic abuse, not just physically separated but genuinely free in their own mind, do not come out harder or colder. They come out more discerning. They learn to tell the difference between love that nourishes and love that drains, between someone who merely mirrors them and someone who actually sees them. They carry a quiet steadiness, not arrogance, not armor, simply the calm of someone who traveled to the deepest part of the darkness and found themselves still there at the bottom, still breathing, still worth everything. You were never a victim waiting to be rescued. You never have been. You were targeted precisely because of your depth, your empathy, your capacity for real devotion. Those are not weaknesses. They are rare, valuable qualities, and someone incapable of generating them within themselves will often spend a lifetime trying to take them from someone who has them freely. They came for your light. They never managed to put it out.